Okay, so today's talk is not going to be about modern monetary theory per se. We're going to talk about ways in which activists can create narratives about our work. So it's very practical. I mean, obviously there'll be principles espoused, but I was asked to be practical here, of empowering people with strategies and tools, and I've been at it for a long time now, and I know all of the sort of pitfalls in pitching narratives and stuff like that. And so I'm hoping we can get some little tools and some ways of thinking and ways of constructing things, and so that's sort of the objective. It's not highbrow. And so the sort of issues are, there's a lot of activists out there who still, in my view, and it's not a criticism, it's particularly, I'm not aiming to be negative, it is a criticism, I'm not aiming to be negative, but it's they lack core knowledge still. Now the problem is that there hasn't ever been a large body of economic theory that's got into the public consciousness in the way we have, via social media and via activism. Mostly economics is disseminated from through the academic literature, through journal publications and through to some extent books, and then the public gets a glimpse of the superficial, in a superficial way, via sort of journalists reporting politicians or something who are getting advised by graduates from economics programs. And the public never really get the full-blown reality of what mainstream economics is actually about. They get some sort of stylised sort of fiction. Whereas what we've written a lot of academic literature. Don't misunderstand me there. But I think we're the first sort of, and it's because of the timing in history. But we've been able to create a direct link to the public through social media, and have an engagement at the level of core knowledge rather than the sort of platitudinal sort of level. I'm not sure platitudinal is a word, but I just made it. So Shakespeare used to make up words. So one of the things that I urge everybody, education is incredibly liberating and powerful, and that requires if you understand core knowledge. And for an activist to empower yourself, I think you really have to spend time, difficult though it is at times, and tedious though it is at times, to acquaint yourself with the core body of literature. It's not a valid approach to say you know modern monetary theory by reading a couple of blogs. Now there's blog posts. There's sufficient. There's quite a technical literature out there that's probably not written for the layperson, and that's not what I'm suggesting. But there's a lot of MMT stuff that we've written in a programmatic way that's accessible, books and articles. The second thing is to anticipate the sort of issues that you're going to be confronted with when you're attempting to discuss this with people. And I can almost tell from the first word of a sentence what the person's going to say to me. I just did an interview with a journalist, and I could have basically done the interview on my own, knowing the sort of questions that emerged. They follow a pattern. And the third thing that we'll look at is developing tools for responses. So when you're around your, at the very basic level, when you're sitting around at the weekend with your family and your old man or your children are hardcore neoliberals, how do you deal with them? And how do you save your marriage? And so we'll go through just a couple of little tools. I mean, there's a lot, but we've got finite time, and so we'll just do a couple of little experiments just to how you can get these ideas across. And a lot of people tell me, since they've come aware of my work and our work with the core sort of group, is that they call it a light bulb moment. And what they're saying is that suddenly, in the fog of it all, they suddenly twigs that they get it. And once you get it, it seems like there's no turning back. It alters your worldview. And so how do you create those light bulb moments? How do you get people to just suddenly see, and without seeing the whole complexity of it, but just see the basic starting point at which alters the way you see the public debate considerably? And I'll talk a bit about framing and language. I do work with, it's my wife actually, Dr. Louise O'Connor. She's a cognitive linguist, and she's really knows a lot about language and the use of metaphorical construction and stuff. And it's really important that as activists we know the pitfalls of framing and language. And we'll have a little. We'll look at Twitter, for example. Okay, a little starting quiz. Now, we're not going to really do the quiz, but these are propositions, and we'll see what the core defences are. I'm presuming everybody in the room knows that every one of these questions is false. the answer. And if you don't, to save you embarrassment, you now know. Okay, so this is a classic mainstream simplification of macroeconomics and the capacities of a currency issuing government. And it's an attempt to manipulate our perceptions of our governments and what they can and can't do by appealing to our own experiences each day as households. It's a classic sort of strategy, and it builds on truth to create a fiction. And so as households, quite clearly we know that we've got a budget constraint. If we want to spend, we have to work out where we're going to get the resources, the financial capacity to spend. And we know that we have to go to work, or we might be able to draw down some savings if our income's not sufficient to do what we want, or we might have to flog an asset on eBay or something that we don't want, or we have to borrow and use our credit card or go to the bank if it's something larger like a house. And so we have a really advanced understanding of our financial constraints. But the problem is that gives us absolutely zero experience to understand what the capacities of a currency issuing government are. It doesn't have any translation at all. And so the sort of way in which you counter somebody that has that view and raises that question, raises that relationship, these are some simple understandings that are absolutely core. We use the currency that the government issues. Totally different perception. And as we'll see in a moment, the currency issuing government can't collect tax revenue until that capacity has been spent into existence prior. And we'll show that categorically in a minute. And while as households we're constrained financially, and so there's all this stuff out there that we might want to advance our material interests that we just can never have because we're never going to be able to get the financial resources. Whereas a currency issuing government can buy whatever is for sale in that currency, including all idle labour. That's unambiguous. It's not an opinion, that's a fact. Whatever is available for sale, a currency issuing government can buy because it issues the currency. And to think that it can run out of money is like saying that the scoreboard runs out of points in a football match 2 minutes after half time and the game has to stop. It's as absurd as that. And that it's true that the government can impose constraints on itself, but that doesn't, so fiscal rules and accounting procedures, that money's got to go into one account before money can go out of another, all these sort of constructs that finance departments or treasuries or whatever put up as constraints on government spending, but that doesn't alter the intrinsic capacity. False. And so the question then is, if an MMT economist like me is saying, well, taxes don't fund government spending, that statement's false, and I guarantee you if we went for a stroll out in the street, I would think 100% of the people we asked would answer true to that statement. So this is core perception in the community that you have to have the tools to alter. Then they'll ask, well, if this mad economist is saying, well, the government isn't financially constrained, why do we pay taxes? Because we certainly pay taxes. I'm a taxpayer. And so you've got to be armed and with a very clear process of creating an understanding of what the role of taxes are if it's not to fund government spending. And the way we think about it in MMT is that taxes create the real resource space in which government can spend. Now this is really important because if the government isn't financially constrained, what is it constrained by other than voluntary rules that are just sort of ideologically or historically based? Well, what constrains the government is the available real resources that it can buy. So it's not a financial constraint, it's a real constraint. And so a government has no resources. It's the non-government, us, that have the labour and the capital that the government has to get hold of and transfer from the non-government sector into the government sector to fulfil its socio-economic mandate. I'm not sure you're allowed to use the word mandate anymore, but you know what I mean. Program. And so it's got to work out a way in which it can get our resources transferred into the public sector so that it can then use them to do its policy programs. And so it's got to basically create sellers of those resources. Well, how does it do that? It levies a tax. What does that do? Well, where are we going to get the resources to pay the tax? And as soon as it imposes a tax on us, there's a demand created for its currency, which is otherwise worthless. These bits of paper, they're just bits of paper. They're not backed by anything. They're not backed by any commodity like gold or silver, they're just worthless bits of paper. Why have I got them in this thing? Because they're worth something. Why are they worth something? Because I can pay my taxes with those and stay out of jail each year. They buy other things, but at the core intrinsic starting point, they create a motivation by us in the non-government sector to offer our services in return for government currency. And that's, so how does that work? Well, the government spends and buys things off us, labour and other resources, as a part of its program, and gives us the wherewithal to pay the taxes. And so another way of thinking about it is that taxes create unemployment, because they deprive us of purchasing power, and therefore there's got to be some idle something somewhere, and then the government spending solves that unemployment that the taxes create. And so when I say that taxes create the real resource space for government to spend, what I'm saying is that if the taxes weren't there, we would have more purchasing power and we'd buy more goods and services for ourselves. And you imagine an economy where all the available resources are being bought by the non-government sector. Well, then if the government tried to then compete for those resources, there'd be inflationary pressures develop. And so the way the government can gain access to those resources that we're using without creating pressures to push the price of the use of those resources up is by depriving us of that capacity to use resources. Taxes do that. They don't fund, they deprive. So this is the argument that all second year macroeconomics students learn, that if the government runs a deficit, that means it's spending more than it's receiving back in taxes. Then it has two other options. It can either fund that deficit by borrowing from the non-government sector, or it can print money. That's what's taught in the economics textbooks. And then the next statement is that if they print money, that will be inflationary, and they have these sort of weird notions of too much money chasing too few goods. And if you've got too increasing supply of money, that has to decrease its value, which is what inflation is. And so to avoid that, the government has to fund that deficit by borrowing money, and that's less inflation. That's less inflationary. Well, the first point is that in a modern monetary system, the government doesn't need to borrow at all. We need to borrow if we want to spend beyond our income, if we've got no assets to sell and no prior savings. But a government doesn't need to do that, because it issues the currency. And moreover, as we'll see in a moment, the funds that the government borrows anyway are really just past deficits that haven't been taxed back. It's tricky. This is core knowledge, so you've got to get your head around it if you want to be an activist. And the other conception that's false is that there's this notion that there's these monetary operations like borrowing or printing that come before the spending. But government spending is done in the same way no matter what monetary operations are accompanying it. government spend by some person in Treasury ringing up its banker, the central bank, in most cases, and saying, listen, we've just put out a purchase order to a pencil supplier to provide pencils for the school system. Can you just credit some accounts, please? And some operator types a few numbers into the banking system from the central bank, and the funds are spent. That's why governments spend. They occasionally send out cheques to people as income support recipients, but increasingly these days they don't even do that. They just type in numbers. And there's no conception that they go and borrow some money and build up a stockpile of it and then they hand it out. They're just typing numbers every minute of every day, probably up in the working hours. And fiat currency is currency that just is created by legislative fiat. It's not commodity. And fiat currency doesn't enter the economy by any printing process. The language of printing money is a loaded term to invoke a scenario of, these wild-eyed government officials in basements running printing presses at an accelerating rate of knots as they lasciviously, spend out of control on ridiculous things, and the economy melts down in a hyperinflationary turmoil. Governments there's no printing involved when the governments spend. And we have to get out of that habit of saying anything about printing. MMT isn't about printing money, even though if you've been reading all our critics lately, their characterisation is that we're just about printing money. No money ever gets printed in spending. I can send this to anybody who wants it, by the way, the slides. Now, it's important to understand this as best you can, the mechanics of what happens when the government spends. Because as part of what we call the payment system or the clearing system, commercial banks keep accounts with the central bank. Because, imagine at the end of every day, the timing of these events differ in different countries. But at the end of each day, Bank A has a cheque drawn against it, which is deposited by a customer in Bank B. And how is that going to be resolved? Well, it's resolved through these accounts that all the banks keep with the central bank. So it's called the clearinghouse or the payment system. And so at the end of each day, all of these millions of transactions that occur during the day between banks are all resolved by accounting adjustments at the central bank in these so-called reserve accounts. And if a bank has a net debit against it at the end of the day, hasn't got enough reserves in the reserve account, it borrows from other banks that might have excess reserves, or ultimately the central bank will always lend banks reserves to cover the gap, to make sure that all the checks clear and all the transactions are resolved. And that's one of the key responsibilities of a central bank, to maintain financial stability. Which is why when the ECB in June 2015 threatened the Greece banking system with collapse, it was actually, working outside its charter to guarantee financial stability, and was becoming just a political attack dog. Which is another reason why you wouldn't want to have anything to do with Europe.
Excuse me, what about 2008 with the financial meltdown? Wasn't that also to do with the instability of the clearing system and their ability to...
Yeah, I mean, that's a sort of separate source of instability, but what basically happened then was that the wholesale funding market where banks borrow to cover their reserve positions froze. In Australia, for example, our big four banks were within a couple of days, because they had outstanding wholesale liabilities borrowing, and they had to turn them over. If they frequently turn these short-term exposures over. And what happened was, when Lehman's collapsed, the wholesale funding market just froze. So our big four banks were within a few days of not being able to turn over loans, that is, borrow more to pay back. And they would have collapsed too. And what happened? The Australian government introduced a policy guaranteeing all wholesale borrowing for its banks, private profit-seeking banks. And just like that, because they had government guarantees, their wholesale funding streams reopened.
And the same in the UK with Gordon Brown's.
Yeah, it happened everywhere. The central governments guaranteed the financial system, and that's what kept the economy from collapse. And nobody asked then, where's the money come from? It was obvious. The government just typed in keystrokes or issued memos saying we'll guarantee it all.
But the political effect has been a Tory agenda of austerity policies.
Sure, we'll talk about that later. And so it's really important to understand this point, that when the government's spending, when it's running a deficit on a daily basis, there's a net flow of government currency going into the banking system. Now, it ends up in these reserve accounts. So, the government's buying stuff off business firms or handing out income support, and all of those flows of government spending and the taxation that's withdrawing money out of the system, all of those, that net result, if there's a deficit, ultimately shows up in these reserve accounts. Once they work their way through the banking system, they show up in these reserve accounts in the central bank. And if there's a And if there's a surplus of these funds on any particular day, well then the thing to understand is that the banks don't earn a commercial rate of return on these excess reserves. So for them it's dead money. What the banks want to do is just keep the minimum amount of reserves to make sure they can cover their clearance positions each day, because they really don't want to borrow off the reserve bank, off the central bank, to bridge a shortfall, because typically the central bank charges a penalty rate on those funds. So what the commercial banks want to do is just maintain as best they can what they'll need to cover each daily position, and then so they don't want any more than that. But what a fiscal deficit does is cause an excess supply of reserve funds in the system overall. We call it a cash surplus. And so what's happening to what the commercial banks then are trying to do is get rid of those excesses. So where might they go? They might ring up their mates in the interbank market, the other banks, to see if they've got deficit positions overnight. If they have, they'll negotiate some interbank loan. But if there's a system-wide surplus, any activity between the banks can't eliminate that. At the end of all of the interbank borrowing, at the end of each day, a surplus is a surplus. And the process through which banks then are trying to eliminate their own individual surpluses by lending them to other banks creates a competitive environment that drives the interest rate down. And if the central bank did nothing and just left that surplus in the system, well then the interest rate would go down to zero. The overnight interest rate, what we call the overnight interest rate. And so while my profession teaches that students that fiscal deficits drive up interest rates, because they've got to be funded by debt, and there's only a finite supply of savings allegedly. And so if the government's going into the savings markets to try to borrow, that's putting upward pressure on the finite pool of savings, which then drives up the rates in which savers are willing to lend. So, and that those rising rates cause private investors who are borrowing to build factories and stuff to reduce their investment because the cost of funds has risen. And so that's what crowding out is. The government deficits are alleged to push up interest rates and crowd out private investment. And then they put a sort of moral story on top of it, and that says that public use of savings is inefficient because it's not disciplined by the market, the capital markets, who only want to put funds into best value use, and drives out efficient private investment, which is driven by market forces. But the reality is quite different, that these deficits that are not dealt with by a central bank, which I'll tell you next, actually drive down interest rates, not up. And this is relating to this point here. Now, how does the central bank, in an environment where there's a fiscal deficit, how does it stop the interest rate from going to zero? So say monetary policy is expressed by a central bank wanting to have a 3% overnight interest rate. And if the fiscal deficit's putting downward pressure in the interbank market, as I described, and driving interest rates down, how does the central bank maintain its 3% overnight interest rate? Well, it's got to do what we call draining that excess supply of reserves. It's got to take that excess supply of reserves that the fiscal deficit has created. It's got to take them out of the liquidity system. How does it do that? It offers the banks a interest-bearing asset that they'll buy and swap the cash reserves. What could that be? A government bond. So the banks don't want to have excess reserves because they don't earn anything, or they earn below a competitive rate, depending which country you're in. So in Australia, the Reserve Bank of Australia pays banks on excess reserves 25 basis points below the monetary policy rate. So it's not competitive. So what happens if there's an excess supply of reserves from the fiscal deficits? The central bank offers the commercial banks the government debt. They conduct an open market operation, it's called. They sell debt which earns a competitive interest, a return, and they drain out the reserves. Now, what they've been doing more recently is just leaving those reserves in the system. And the other way of dealing with it is to just pay a competitive return on the reserves, which is what's happened since the crisis. So there's this massive build-up of reserves out there that the central bank is just paying a return on, which then stops the banks trying to get rid of their excess reserves because they're now earning a competitive rate. So all that liquidity is just stuck in the system, doing nothing other than earning income for the reserve holders, the banks, being paid for by the central government through its central bank. No problem. It's a currency issuing government, can do that if it wants. Japan does it differently. Japan doesn't pay a support on excess reserves, leaves a bit of excess reserves, they're clever, leaves some excess reserves in the system, and what have we witnessed since the early 90s? Zero interest rates. And the Bank of Japan manages that zero interest rate environment by just because the Japanese government's running large fiscal deficits. Each day, each night, there's excess reserves being built up in the banking system. The central bank drains some by issuing debt, but leaves excess reserves in the system, keeps the competitive pressure in the interbank market, and the interest rate stays at zero. It's stayed there for 30 years. So don't ever be misled into thinking that the government can't control yields, interest rates. Bank of Japan shows perfectly how it's done. Bank of Japan or any central bank can control yields forever. And the other thing to understand, and this is, I know it's onerous getting all this stuff rammed down your throat, but the other thing to understand is what I've just said is also gives you ammunition about this central bank independence myth. Because I've just described a situation that on a daily basis, the central bank has to cooperate with the Treasury. Treasury runs fiscal policy. Central bank runs the liquidity maintenance of the cash system. Selling bonds into the system or putting an interest rate support on excess reserves. Those things are intrinsically linked. They can't be separated. So every day in Australia and elsewhere, the central bank officials have a meeting with the Treasury officials and work out, well, what's going to be the impacts on the cash system today from fiscal policy that you know. And that gives the central bank then an idea of what it has to do in terms of its bond manipulations and sales and interest rate adjustments on support rates and stuff. They can't be independent. Now that's apart from the political lack of independence where the elected government typically appoints the central bank officials. So they can't be independent in that sense. And it can't be independent in the sense that the central banks are typically a creature of legislation of the government. But even if you ignore those higher level dependencies, the daily mesh between fiscal policy and monetary policy, it happens. It has to happen, otherwise the system can't work. All right. And I think I've mentioned this about downward pressure. And to put a finer point, I'm not advocating this necessarily, but as currency issuing government, the Bank of England could buy up all the debt if it wanted to, if you were worried about the outstanding debt.
So on that point, the Japanese central bank owns a fairly substantial amount of the Japanese government bonds outstanding, I think.
Well, that's another story.
Oh, is it?
No, but not only the Bank of Japan, Bank of England,
For example,
European Central Bank, Federal Reserve Bank has been buying massive amounts of government debt in the secondary bond market. So since June 2012, the Bank of Japan has basically bought up all of the government debt that's been issued. It holds massive amounts of government debt, as does the ECB, as does the Bank of England.
So maybe we get to that, but why not cancel it rather than just hold it in a...
Well, this is the next question. This is the next point. And so then the mainstream economists say, well, that's dangerous because the central bank could go broke because it might make losses on the bonds that it's bought. Well, the European Central Bank, for example, could, if I rang them up now and convinced them, they could just type whatever trillion euros they hold in government bonds of the 19 member states. They could just instruct an operator to type 0 instead of a 30 trillion or whatever it is. And nothing would happen. Absolutely nothing would happen, other than the banks would, the member states would suddenly realise that they've got X trillion less debt. Nothing would happen. running fiscal surpluses builds up funds. So this is a really classic one that governments are facing age. So they relate it to a real problem, the ageing society problem, rising dependency ratios. That will reduce the reduce the number of people that are actually productive in our economies, our societies, and render more people who are dependent on the productivity of a smaller group. That's what a rising dependency ratio is. And they construct that as a financial crisis because characters like me are going to need health care and pensions and all that stuff. And the government will run out of money being able to provide that. That's how they construct it. So then they say we've got to save up now to build up the capacity to be able to fund the ageing society needs. And so that's a sort of smokescreen they use for running surpluses or trying to run surplus or running austerity. Now, the first point is that the ageing society issue is real. The countries, many of our advanced countries, and Japan's leading the way, have rising dependency ratios. But that's not a financial problem, that's a productivity problem. The problem is that we're going to require our children to be more productive than we are because there's less of them producing and there's more of us being dependent on what they produce for our material standard of living. So they've got to be more productive than we were. That's the problem. And so if you reconstruct the problem like that, then what that motivates is a discussion on, well, what can the government do to enhance productivity? Well, what enhances productivity? Education is the primary. Research and education are the things that allow a society to be more productive. And what does austerity do when you construct it as a financial problem and therefore pretend you've got to save up? Well, austerity tends to hack into education and research. Austerity tends to hack into the opportunities of young school leavers to get work experience and training. The very things that are going to make them more productive. We've now got a rising cohort called the NEETs. The NEETs are not in employment, education or training. They're teenagers who are dislocated from the system, from the typical pathways, from formal schooling into training into paid work. Austerity is generating a lost generation of kids. And they're our future productivity. So it's exactly in Australia we're having these massive cutbacks in education and apprenticeship training and all of the things that generated the high productivity growth in the 60s that gave people like me, as I was growing up in that era, massive material benefits and mobility options upwards. And so the answer, fiscal surpluses undermine, exacerbate the ageing society problem. They don't give anything to help it. And the primer on it is that the ability of the government to spend today has no bearing on what it did yesterday. Running a fiscal surplus gives the government no extra funds to spend today than it had yesterday. Governments do not save. So this is a sort of, again, an analogy with households. We save. Why do we save? Why do we sacrifice why do we not spend all of our income? Because we want to have higher future consumption possibilities. And how do we achieve that, given we're financially constrained? We forego consumption today, we put it in the bank and earn a bit of interest rate, pitiful these days, but that gives us higher consumption possibilities in the future, as long as inflation doesn't outstrip it. we have to do that to increase our future consumption. That's what the role of saving is. But a currency issuing government doesn't have to do that because it can buy tomorrow whatever it wants that's available.
The criticism we have to come up with there is to go, but Norway, the wealth fund, look what they've done. They can afford this, that, and the other. Why is a wealth fund necessary?
The wealth fund isn't necessary, but in Norway's case, it serves the role as an anti-inflationary mechanism. Because the government has to run surpluses in Norway because their external revenue coming in is so strong for the time being, and the non-government private domestic sector can save, so they're achieving their saving ambition. The public sector is providing first. I was in Norway just recently in February, and the standard of public infrastructure is dramatic. It's fantastic. So the country's able to have first-class public services and infrastructure. The private domestic sector is able to save a little bit and withdraw some of their income from spending cycle. And the government has to run surpluses in that environment because they're getting a lot of external revenue. So, but the question you need to ask is, does the investment in those financial assets mean that the government has more spending power when the North Sea resources run out? And the answer is no. It doesn't need that extra. Yeah, it could liquidate the fund and it's got all this cash, but it's already got unlimited quantities of cash. So it's not a buffer for the future, it's a buffer to stop inflation occurring. Most countries aren't in that position. And so, once again, the decision to spend is just always a political decision, not a financial problem. All right, so is there any questions about that? They're the sort of typical, a selection of very typical sort of complaints people make about anybody who advocates the sort of things, using deficits to improve material well-being, etc. Yeah.
I hate to mention Venezuela, but it's something that always crops up in comments on posts about MMT and do you want to end up like Venezuela, or Zimbabwe's the other one, and clearly that's a very unique set of circumstances.
Well, I wouldn't want to end up like Venezuela and have CIA corruption undermining my political democracy and corporations are deliberately undermining the economy and being paid through the back door by American government. I wouldn't want to be in that situation. It says nothing about MMT.
No.
Now, Zimbabwe, there's an article in the Australian press today. We've got an election on now. Our federal election's next Saturday, and it's gone crazy, the sort of surplus discussion. But there's an article by one of the esteemed business commentators. It's talking about this problem. There's a growing discussion about MMT and a growing discussion about, even from central bankers now, that we're getting to a point where fiscal policy is going to have to become more liberal. And this guy, who's very, one of the top guys, said, if you think this crazy MMT idea, we just have to use Zimbabwe. Look at what happened in Zimbabwe. Mm. I've written to the ABC, which is Australian Broadcasting Commission, this morning asking him to be sacked.
Good luck with that.
No, disgrace, total disgrace. But the point is, how many people in the room know what happened in Zimbabwe? In detail.
They borrowed a lot of foreign currency.
How many people know in detail what happened? But how many people know they had hyperinflation and they ran big deficits and they borrowed a lot of money? Come on, everybody knows that. Well, you know virtually nothing. Because the experience in Zimbabwe provides no understanding of the role of deficits in an economy. Because what happened in Zimbabwe, and we're diverting, but it's important, is that Robert Mugabe fought a long a war against the British, to get the whites out of control of Rhodesia. And part of the settlement after they won the struggle was that he wanted to do two things. He wanted to redress the unbelievably unequal land tenure arrangements where the blacks, who were the majority, owned nothing and the whites owned everything. And he also wanted to provide material rewards to the freedom fighters who were soldiers, and they, in a peaceful economy, what were they going to do? Now the war was over. So they were all, in my view, progressive, admirable ambitions. He just blew it, because what he did was he expropriated the farms from the white farmers and gave them to the soldiers. Now, Zimbabwe was the food bowl of Africa. It had the most efficient agriculture, one of the most efficient agricultural sectors in the world. The white farmers were pretty good farmers. And he took those farms off them and gave them to soldiers who were good at shooting up at people, but not great farmers. And in a very short time, output collapsed by about 60%. Massive supply side contraction. And then it got worse because of the food shortages. The central bank then started to ration access to foreign currency in the foreign exchange market, so that the people who would typically access those foreign exchange resources would be manufacturers to buy capital for the manufacturing sector, and they were starved out of funds, so the manufacturing sector went into decline, a further supply side contraction. Now, in that environment, any spending was going to cause hyperinflation, private or public. It was nothing
because there really was too much currency chasing too few resources.
But it wasn't because of the deficits, it was because of the supply side contraction.
Yeah, the lack of resources.
Lack of goods and services. So that tells you nothing about, sure, if the British government goes and closes down all of the producers and keeps and we keep trying to consume and they keep trying to consume, you'll get hyperinflation. What does that tell you about a normal society? Nothing. And when I was young, I mean, you're younger than me, so you've used Zimbabwe, but when I was young, it was the Weimar Republic. And it's a similar story. It's a massive supply shock. Tells you nothing about when you've got a massive supply side contraction. So suddenly the shops are empty. The food markets had no food, and so what food was being offered was then getting bid up in price. Just to obvious.
Supply and demand.
Obvious. And so then the higher prices create a nominal demand for more money creation. But this is the point that Malcolm's just raised. It's carts and horses. What came first? The supply contraction. So Zimbabwe, in that context, what they could have done was just starve the economy of extra nominal resources, money, to choke the inflation off what would have happened? People would have starved.
Yeah. Riots.
People would have rioted, people would have starved, people would have died. So they didn't do that, which I wouldn't have done either, and the problem emerged.
They needed to resolve the problem with food production.
Yeah, but they had stuffed it. So, but it gives you no it gives you no knowledge of what would happen in a normal society like Australia or Britain. We've run continuous deficits for about 80% of our recorded history.
Like 300 years in the UK. Isn't it?
I mean, there's a great Bank of England historical database you can download. It's a big spreadsheet. It's fantastic. It goes back to the 16th century or something. It's really brilliant, and patched together the whole history of your data. It's really good. We go and check out how many deficits stacks.
So just one quick question on your second bullet. So I think people can readily understand the idea of the government creating money when it creates those balances at the central bank in order to spend. But when it runs a surplus, so we're taxing more money out of the economy than we're spending in, why? It's the word destroys I struggle with. So what
In our next little role play, we'll see how that works.
Sorry.
But yeah, we'll leave it till then. Who wants to be the non-government sector? One person. You need to stand up here.
Oh, okay, I'll be the non-government sector.
You'll embarrass yourself.
That's all right.
Welcome to the non-government sector.
Hello.
Hello, non-government sector.
And of course,
All
I'm
the
the
wealth comes from him.
I'm the government sector. You
I'm
can
the
see
rich
how-
person.
You can see how crazy I am on the government sector.
He's nuts.
Okay, so we're going to have a new currency. Here's one, I just created it. There's a note, it's called the bill. As in the bill. And all transactions in this economy are digital, except we're going to defy that because we're going to have some paper. And the first year I announce that you, non-government sector, is now have to pay me every month 100 bills.
You haven't given me anything. I don't have anything.
I'll go to jail.
So as part of my introduction to this new currency, I've levied a tax, 100 bills. Got a few of them. Well, I think I'm going to tax 600 actually. Yeah, that's what I was going to do.
Have I never done anything for you?
So would you like to do some public work? And
Oh, absolutely. I'll build you a new bridge. We have great bridge.
I don't want any bridges. I want universities
Oh, yes, I love them too.
and beautiful running tracks in parks.
Oh, I don't know about that. You might have to crowdfund that.
I'm struggling to get my 600 digital. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
So he's now busily working for the public sector, producing. I've just transferred real resources into the public sector.
You've just overpaid me.
Have I? Government incompetence, you see.
Oh, they want something for it.
So he's now busily adding value to the society through the aegis of public sector infrastructure and other programs, providing services to the non-government sector. And now I want the taxes, please.
How many?
600. There's the parameters, 600.
Whoa, you just paid me 600. I've spent some of it.
All right, so at the end of the month, we now look at the fiscal accounts and the non-government accounts. What's the fiscal balance going to be?
600.
Fiscal balance is the difference between government and taxation and spending.
Zero.
So I'm running a balanced budget in inverted commas, and you'll see why I say that later. And what's the national debt? And what's the non-government saving in the currency?
Zero.
How much money do I have?
Ah,
Minus.
not a lot.
Yeah.
As I say, you started.
I've just got to find my code. I've got another bit of paper, but I don't know where it is.
It's out in the hallway. It's near the table, Bill.
And what's the quantity of non-government financial assets in this currency?
Zero.
And how much cash is he holding in the currency?
Zero.
How much government debt has he got?
None.
Right, good, thank you. So what have we learnt in the first month?
Nothing.
And as they say, you sir are a deal.
There's a lot of me about.
But you ripped me off.
No, I didn't rip you off. I conducted I conducted the affairs of the state in an appropriate legal manner, using the currency capacity that I have. All right, so we have a. No. So what did we learn in the first month? We learned very important knowledge about the currency. We learned that until there's spending, there's no capacity to pay taxes. And by creating a tax obligation, I immediately got the non-government sector to do stuff for me. Because why would he want this worthless bit of paper? I just got some scissors and wrote some numbers. Taxes function to create the demand for government spending. And if the fiscal position is balanced, there can be no net saving or net financial asset accumulation. That is an incredibly powerful lesson already, because that's completely the opposite to what mainstream economics says happens. And you saw it before your very eyes. There was no juggling, no mystery. All right, so we're now going Mr. Non-Government Sector or Ms. Non-Government Sector, whatever.
Bill, could you just say what would happen if he had a loan from the private bank? I mean, I sort of know the story, but you want to put it in your own words?
We don't have a private bank.
Okay.
Sorry, could you say that question again? Because up here, and your voice going that way.
He wants to know if he had been able to borrow from a private bank.
All right.
And I said at the moment we haven't got any private banks.
Thank you.
But what would happen?
Well, you'd have to pay the loan back.
Yeah. There's no net finance. Transactions within the non-government sector create no net financial assets. Because while the bank loan creates a liability, it creates an offsetting asset.
And you'd have to get the interest money from you.
Yeah. That's just more. We want to avoid complications.
Sorry.
So now we're going to introduce saving into the economy.
Phasing.
Saving. So I'm a government that has this idea that I want individuals in the non-government sector to have an ability to risk manage their lives, make their own decisions. If their car breaks down, they'll be able to fix it or whatever. So it's good that we have a saving. We're able to meet a saving desire. So he naturally wants to save some of this. Hold on. and as a government, I can facilitate his saving desire. All right, so are you still prepared to do work for the government sector?
Oh, absolutely.
It's 800.
800.
So I've now expanded employment,
Oh.
and I've expanded the GDP of the economy, which is the total measured income produced in the economy. It's gone up from 600 to 800. That's a flow of production, a flow of income generated. I've increased employment because you've got to construct the John government sector here as a whole lot of people. So that I've now brought more people into production and more people into employment, and now I want 600 in taxes, please.
Okay. So I only
Just take out 2 and give me the rest.
I wasn't going to try to shortchange it.
No, I know, it's all digital. Now, what's the fiscal balance in this second month?
200.
Is it a deficit or a surplus?
Deficit.
It's a deficit, and it's a flow. So it's very important you understand the difference between a flow and a stock. A flow is measured over time, a stock is measured at a point in time, and you'll see the difference in a second. So in month 2, we've had a flow of expenditure into the economy of 800 and a flow of drain going out via taxing of 600. And then the net amount left in the system, which is my deficit, is 200 bills. What's the national debt? I haven't issued any debt yet.
Oh,
What's the non-government saving? Savings is the amount of income that you've got that you haven't spent.
200.
I haven't spent it yet.
No, 200 bills in the non-government sector. And what's the total non-government financial assets at the moment?
200.
So the flow of a 200 deficit has created a stock of financial assets in the non-government sector equal to that, dollar for dollar, bill for bill. How much cash has the non-government sector? I should gender him. Has the non-government sector got?
200.
How much bonds has he got? Nothing.
Yeah.
What lessons have we learned in month 2? Good.
The bonds have nothing to do with government spending.
So that's the accounting sheet there. You can see it quite clearly. So, what have we learnt in month 2? That the
savings of the cash held by the non-government sector is the deficit that you've got.
is exactly equal to the accumulated deficit.
And government spending has to happen first.
And the government spending has to happen first. And the government deficit is the only way that he can, I can't keep saying he or she or something, but that the non-government sector can exercise and realise their desire to save. Now, he mightn't want to save 200, and we're abstracting from the complexity of what he does with that, but that's unimportant for this simplistic example. Okay, so month 3, we're going to create a debt instrument. Now, I'm a very moral government, and I believe in thrift. And because I want to reward thrift and reward people who are willing to risk manage, as it stands, those 200 bills are sitting there earning nothing. They're just in a bank somewhere. And all they do at the moment is they allow the non-government sector not to work in the future. That's sort of what they mean. And so there's excess liquidity in the system. And at the moment the rate of interest therefore would be 0. And so to encourage him to continue saving, I reward it by offering him a return on those. And so I announce that I'm going to offer anybody who wants to convert cash savings into bonds a 10% return. Very high, very generous. Okay, so parameters for the next year. Oh, at this point, it's necessary to understand too. So, in that sort of scenario, a rational person like the non-government sector would work out what they're likely to need on a short-term risk basis and then invest the rest. And so what effectively the government is doing is just borrowing back deficits that they've created in the future, in the past. Because the 200 is my last deficit. The spending that I didn't tax that way. In the first month I taxed away all my spending. In the second month I didn't tax all of it. So I left some out there. And all I'm doing now is offering them a chance to earn a bit of interest on that. So in effect, I'm going to take back some of that. But it was because I generated it. there could be no conception that that is funding what I'm about to do next. Okay, so oh God, I've got 4 crowds in the money here.
Oh, thank you.
This is going to get tedious. There's 6.
Not for the private sector, it isn't.
The mad printing starts.
How often do you get the government giving you anything?
There you go. We're just going out of control now.
I can't wait.
There you go. I've just now spent 800. And I'm taxing 600.
Oh, you want me to give you 600 back?
Thank you.
There's 2, 4, 6.
Thank you. 600 back tax. I just account for that, and then I can chuck it in the bin. It doesn't matter. See how I was able to just digitally create currency? I didn't need that at all. And then I'm going to just have a bond. Want to buy some bonds?
Sure.
How much do you want to buy? 400.
I'll buy 100.
Thanks. No, you won't. You'll buy 400.
Oh yeah, I've got 400.
Not playing the game.
I've just swapped just a bit of paper, just a letter from the government saying thanks very much. And I've just, this 400 that's his savings, I just, and what I actually do in an accounting sense, this, I would transfer the 400 from one account, because that 400 would be in the banking reserve system that he had in his savings. And when I issued a bond, he's now got a bond. When I issue the bond, all I do at the central bank is I type a number 0 in the reserve account and 400 in the bond account. That's it.
So what's the point? Is one an interest bearing?
The bond account's called an interest bearing account, and the reserve account's a non-interest bearing account.
So he's making something back.
All I do, he will get it back when the interest starts to flow. And all I do is I extinguish the reserve account, 0 now, not 400, and I add 400 to the bond account.
Does the government always sell bonds first to member banks who then sell it to private individuals, or is there a market where private individuals, so in other words, is it always money that's already in the central bank system, or could you have money coming from a private bank person's account and then?
Well, there's a confusion there.
Okay.
So I'm abstracting from the institutional arrangements of bond issuance here.
Okay.
But the way it happens in the real world is that the Treasury departments appoint a set of authorised dealers, it's called. In Australia we call it that, but that's what it's called everywhere, sort of. And these authorised dealers make the market, is what it's called. And so they're allowed, in what's called the primary issuing of the debt, the market makers, these authorised dealers, are invited to tender for the auction. And so they put in all their bids of what they're prepared to lend the money at. And then there's a process through which the auction comes up with, depending upon how much volume is being lent, according to the bid for it. A yield emerges and the money flows. And then what those people with the bonds will do in the real world is they then use some of them for prudential requirements from the Basel Accord and all that stuff, but then they will then seek to profit in the secondary bond market by trading these bonds and trying to get profit to swap the bonds in the secondary bond market. So what the money that was initially in the banking system to buy the primary issue comes out of the reserve accounts that the commercial banks keep with the central bank. And so when they win the auction and transfer say they win the bid and they get the letter about the bond, the central bank debits their reserve accounts and records the liability from the government to the non-government sector in the debt account somewhere. But it's only a transfer of numbers, isn't it?
Are you saying there's no need to actually convert public money into private debt? That this is a completely artificial mechanism?
Oh yeah, I didn't do it to get any resources. I did it because I wanted the non-government sector to earn an interest on otherwise zero interest saving.
So it's a mechanism that suits the private sector?
Yeah, I mean the way I characterise it is it's corporate welfare. Because, and I've got a very interesting anecdote. We'll interrupt the little role play for a second. When the Liberal government, that's our version of the Tory government, came to power in 1996, they were really gung-ho about eliminating all the public debt. And so they started to run fiscal surpluses. At the same time, they deregulated the financial markets, which led to a massive credit binge in the household sector, which kept the economy growing, which meant that it delayed the negative effects of the fiscal surpluses. But what happened by the end of the century, like by about 2000, the bond market, the secondary bond market in Australia was starting to get what we call thin. That means there wasn't much debt to be traded, because as the debt matured, the government didn't renew it because it was running surpluses. And who do you think complained? Well, the people that complained were the Sydney Futures Exchange and big investment banks in Melbourne and Sydney, and they demanded the government keep issuing debt. Now, the logic seemed to escape them, that according to their own logic and the logic of the mainstream, the only reason you'd be issuing debt would be to fund the deficits. But the government was running ever-increasing surpluses. And so it became very transparent. There was a government inquiry, which I was an expert witness at. And the upshot of the government inquiry was that the government agreed that even though it was going to keep it running increasing surpluses, that it would issue a minimum amount of debt each year to satisfy the investment bankers. It became totally transparent what the debt was doing, because the investment bankers wanted it because it's risk-free. And so they can, in times of uncertainty, they can park their funds and alter their portfolios towards a lower risk position by buying government bonds and trading out of more risky assets. Hold on. And they also use the government debt because it's risk-free then to use what we call a benchmark to price other assets at, which are riskier. It's corporate welfare. And the irony of it, he's first, and the irony of it is that the irony of it is that the same people that were pleading to the government, you're getting tired, non-government sector?
I haven't had any interest yet.
Yeah, well, we'll get there. There's people who are too curious. I'm trying to run a fly-by-night operation here. And the curious thing was the ones who were desperately demanding the debt be continued were the same people that in another debate were demanding the government cut income support to the most disadvantaged people. This is our esteemed business leaders in Australia. Yes.
Could issuing bonds be socially useful? I mean, could it be counter-inflationary? Say if too much investment money was, say the economy was at full employment, land, capital, labour, full employment.
You need to speak up.
And there's too much investment money chasing already a fully employed economy. Couldn't issuing bonds divert investment and money out of the economy and counter-inflation?
It drains. The point he's making is that you saw that he's now got a bit of paper, and I took 400 bills out of the economy that he could have spent. That's your point.
Yeah.
And the question is, yes, that's true, but it wasn't being spent. It was his desires to save. And if he really wanted to have his desire to save and spend, he could have just gone and borrowed money from the bank anyway.
But we shouldn't be completely cynical about bond operations. They can be counterinflation.
Look, progressives could have a case for bond. I don't think it reduces inflation risk.
It doesn't.
No. Because he wasn't spending the money anyway. He was expressly building up 400 to save. Now you've got to abstract from the fact that we're not having consumption in this economy, but he could have spent all that 400, and instead he wanted to save it, as evidenced by the fact that he bought a bond. Now, think about this, if we had no saving in the economy, he could still go wild by borrowing. So the issuing the bond doesn't alter his capacity to borrow, necessarily.
But it takes investment money out of the economy.
But it was already out of the spending cycle. Inflation is a spending risk. It's not money in the economy. There's a difference. This is the really important, but it's a good question. The money wasn't in the spending stream, it was saving. And if it had have been dis-saving, then it would have gone in the spending stream, and then it would have been adding to inflation pressures, but it wasn't. So the act of just swapping it for that, and swapping a number in one central bank account to another and giving him a bit of paper, doesn't change the spending in the economy. Now your point is it might change the propensity to spend, and that's true. But then I would adjust my deficit position then.
It would have.
Claire, sorry. Claire.
One thing I come up against a lot of the time is that people have no idea, your average person in the street got no idea about bond sales or anything else like that. They seem to be under the impression that the Bank of England is some sort of private bank owned by very rich people who physically lends money to the government. So even getting to this point about, what government debt is a very complicated process because they have to completely undo everything that they just believed. A point of trying to get across that the government owns the Bank of England, and that we don't actually borrow from the Rothschilds or anybody else like that is one that I come up with quite a lot. So
or that the Bank of England is owned by the Rothschilds.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I mean, we just borrowed 400.
Yeah.
And all it was is 2 months of deficits that we had previously run.
Yeah.
Would you, if you were doing this with a group oneself, could one have you as the government and another person who would be the bank on your side? So you sort of divide. So you'd be Parliament and you'd say you're the Treasury, and I'm going to tell you to give the money to get that step in between.
Yeah. Once you understand the basic principles, you can. I've got a role play like this where I bring in some neighbours who are the external sector.
Yeah.
And you can make it more complicated, but we're just giving you ideas first to how to do this sort of stuff.
Is that business about the government?
Yes. With regard to whether the bonds taking the money out of the economy affects inflation or not, what about the argument that if the government engineered the interest rate to go up, it would change the incentive so that people would be entitled, would be tempted, even they might have wanted to spend it and create inflation, but if they raised the interest rate on the yield on the bond, then they would change their mind and they would take it out of the economy. And isn't that a picture of the orthodox way of why interest rates control inflation?
Sure.
So in that sense, there is a mechanism where bonds, by raising the interest rate, could be a tool for creating inflation. How do you?
Well, I'm just unclear what you mean by raise the interest rates by selling bonds.
Well, if you're saying the government can control the yields on the bonds, so if the yields were okay.
I mean, at the moment, people are lending countries for 10 years at negative interest rates.
Yeah.
They're lending Japan for 10 years. They're giving the Japanese government money that the Japanese government has previously deficit spent and paying the government to do it. That's what a negative interest rate is. Anyway, we'll keep going, huh? I'm just losing my train of thought here. Right, so we'll have a look at the accounts. So at the end of month 3, you can see we've spent 800. We've created a stable employment environment. Public services are pumping, and I've just run a second month of fiscal balance of deficits, and you can see those minus 200s are flows of net spending, and they don't accumulate. They're just flows of net spending. When they're gone each month. And at the end of the third month, because I've issued bonds, my national debt's now 400, so I've swapped money from a reserve account in the central bank to a debt account. It's all debt is. It's just accumulated fiscal deficits that I haven't taxed away, that I'm now offering to swap for a bit of paper.
Just to be clear, when you taxed him in the first period, you kind of threw the money away.
Yeah.
But when he's now giving you money and you've issued him a bond, again, that cash is just gone, or does it?
No, it's a number. We're using this for visual purposes, but all we've done is typed a number, 0 in one account and 400 in the other. And non-government sector, you can see now that their non-government saving was 200 in month. So savings is also a flow that you see on a monthly basis. So in this third month he saved an additional 200, and the saving accumulates into a stock of wealth. Wealth is a stock concept. And so he saved 200 in month 2, 200 in month 3, and that now accumulates into his stock of wealth of 400. And because I offered him a bond, I established an interest rate of 10% in the economy, which previously it was 0, and he converted his portfolio of wealth into the bond. That's what's happened. All right, you happy so far?
I haven't got any interest yet.
No, well, you
It's kind of pedantic, isn't he?
He's a shocking non-government sector. Okay, so this is what we've learned. The accumulated public deficits equal the accumulated private savings. Penny for penny. It's accounting, it's not an opinion. And that in turn equals the accumulated stock of financial assets, which can be split between cash and bonds, but in this case he's chosen for simplicity to have it in bonds. We've now established a rate of interest because of the issuing of bonds, and all of that has nothing to do with funding the government spending. Nothing at all. It's a monetary operation, but it's unrelated to my capacity to write numbers on these bits. And I do this with kids, and I tell them that when they were asleep one night, I got on the internet and found an IMF report, and told me household was going to run out of money. So we have to have some austerity. I've been running deficits. We're out of control here. I've been writing numbers on bits of paper. So month 4, oh gosh, bloody hell. I use a Mac and not a Windows system right there. So in month 4, did I have the parameters up there? Yeah, month 4 parameters. Okay, so he gets a digital transfer of that's the interest on the bond. 10%, he had 400. Got to get some more digital currency here, and $500. I've announced austerity. I'm cutting back because I'm worried that I'm going to run out of money and the system's going to collapse.
Is he going to do
I'm now what?
Is he going to do the job for you?
Well, he is multiple people, and multiple people now have less income, and you can devise all sorts of scenarios on what that might mean. But basically, I've reduced output in the economy. I'm cutting back on services, or I'm cutting back on infrastructure development, and I've reduced employment. Okay. Now I want 600 in taxes.
Oh, just a minute.
How much you got?
Oh, not. Haven't shortchanged.
How much you got? Announce it.
400.
No.
And then you want much? There's 200.
You got 540 for God's sake.
Yes.
So what he's got available to him in income and cash resources is 540. He's also got this bond of 400. Hold that in one hand and the other in the other. Thank you. And he's got a tax liability of 600. So what am I doing to the non-government sector?
Putting him in debt.
What's my fiscal balance in that month?
Plus 60.
Surplus or deficit?
Surplus.
Of 60?
Yes.
So I've now done the austerity trip and I'm running a surplus of 60. And he's consulted, he's been trying to generate liquidity to pay his tax obligation, and he's found out he's only got 540. But he's got also a bond worth 400. That's his wealth. So I'm squeezing him for liquidity. And this is now coming back to your question earlier. So he gives me 540.
Well, he's done.
And then, yeah, I've got a bit of paper. Well, we'll do it here. It'll be even more illustrative. 340. 340. What does that mean? It means that he's had to liquidate some of his wealth. And in this economy, the only way he could do that would be to sell some bonds back to the government sector. And his wealth now is, he's got no cash, he's got 340.
Less income next period as well.
He's cleared his tax liability. He's working less. There's less public services and less GDP, gross domestic product. Economy's slowing down. So what did we just learn? We learned that fiscal surpluses destroy non-government wealth. Dollar for dollar. It's not an opinion, it's accounting. And when governments say that fiscal surpluses are storing up bills to pay future needs, they're lying, because I don't need them. I can produce digital currency whenever I want it. Whenever I want to provision the non-government sector, I can just enter the currency. And when that extinction of wealth gives me no extra currency, no extra capacity to introduce currency next period. So there's the accounting. You can see it very clearly. See in month 4, his savings desires were undermined. He reduced his savings by negative 60. He had negative 60. And my surplus was exactly equal to his 60 inability to save, his negative saving. And negative saving was accomplished by him destroying some of his prior saving, which was stored as wealth. Okay, it gets worse. So this gets tricky, and I think we'll just move through it without the illustrations. But so non-government sector, you can sit down because I'm about to send you insolvent. The debtors' prison is there. Thank you for your generosity. Thanks for non-government sector. So basically, it's just more of the same. You can see what happens in month 5. I tax 600. I cut back even further and pay wages of 405. I'm paying $34 bills in interest because his outstanding stock of wealth was 340, 10%, 34. The fiscal balance in month 5 is my surplus is now 161 in that month because 439 minus 600. The taxes is a surplus of 161, and so a neoliberal chancellor would be saying this: we're doing exactly the right thing for the people. We're getting the debt monkey off the backs of the government. We're saving up for the future. All the things you hear from your politicians. But what you can see is, I'll go to the account. What you can see is that. My national debt's coming down, and I'll say, look, we're retiring debt, we're making the country more robust. But what they're actually doing, you can see interest payments to the non-government sector have dropped by 6 bills. So what they're actually doing is reducing our income. And I used to think that income was, and I still do, that income flows are good to the non-government sector. So when they're retiring out, when they're running surpluses, they're reducing our flow of income from interest payments. And you can see that in my saving in month 5 is minus 161. That's the liquidity squeeze, because that equals my surplus. And the amount of income I've provided through government spending is significantly less than the amount I'm requiring them to give me back in taxes. And as a result, they've got to liquidate another 161 bills of their wealth to meet the liquidity squeeze. Did you have a question?
Yes. I was under the impression that the national debt was all the money the government had spent into the non-government sector that it hadn't yet taxed, but here it seems to only be affected by bond issuance. Yeah. Okay, so does that mean that not all private sector savings are part of the national debt, only that which bound up in bonds?
That's the way I'm constructing it. Right. All right, and so then, we can take it to the ridiculous end where I finally, the bottom right-hand element, 0. I've wiped out all non-government debt, wealth. I've had ongoing surpluses. I've squeezed the liquidity of the non-government sector, which just means, in English, that I'm spending less to them and generating less income than I'm demanding back in taxes. So the only way they can liquidate their tax obligation is by running down their wealth. And so the logical extension of just ongoing austerity is that you ultimately destroy non-government sector, all the wealth. And as obviously, because I'm creating less growth in the economy, there's less employment, less services, and all the rest of it. So it's both a flow disaster but a stock disaster also, because I'm destroying non-government sector wealth. Are there any questions about that? Yeah.
I mean, one gets the impression that nonetheless it's the non-government sector that has been pressing for the government to pursue this sort of policy. I mean, if you think of the non-government sector as simply being private.
Well, this relates to the next part of the talk. It's all very logically organised. As I said at the beginning, there is an agenda out there, and there's a smokescreen that's been created by that agenda.
Yeah.
And so the smokescreen is that they've created a fictional world where a chancellor can get, a treasurer in Australia can get up and say that by running surpluses, they're providing for the future. They're getting the debt monkey off our back. they're taking the burden off our grandchildren. Whereas that's the fiction. Whereas in actual fact, what they've done is undermine our future. They've reduced our income. They've created less opportunity for employment.
What's in it for them?
What?
What's in it for them?
Yes.
Well, what's in it for them is, meanwhile, back at the ranch, they're busily redistributing income from workers to bosses.
Yeah.
They're paying. They're rewarding. They're using government policies to reward their lobbying mates who are at the top end of town. That's what's in it for them.
Quite.
The private debt helps the top end of town, the growth of private debt.
Yeah, well, and ultimately, that's why the Australian government agreed to keep issuing debt, even though they were running surpluses. So they weren't doing this.
No, I mean, if you push the 90% into borrowing to pay for costs as opposed to getting an income, that helps the money manager capitalism.
Yeah. So the last part of the talk is about framing and language. And one of the ways that, this is answering your question really, one of the ways in which we've been duped is because the neoliberal elites have worked out how we understand reality and how that understanding of reality can be manipulated through framing and the sort of language they use. And this relates to sort of cognition, how as individual citizens we relate to our external world. How do we understand what's going on? And you can manipulate that understanding with metaphorical concepts and language and framing. So let's have a little talk about that. This is George Lakoff, who's a very famous linguist, and he's got what he calls the truth sandwich that activists always have to learn. And the truth sandwich is you never privilege a lie by leading with it. You always start off with the truth in discussion with somebody, and then you note the attempt to divert the truth, and I'll give you examples of this in a minute, and then you can return to the truth the lie is designed to hide. So in a specific context, you would never have a Labor Party fiscal credibility rule if you understood the truth sandwich. You would never have a rule. You would never even talk about fiscal credibility in relation to a deficit to GDP ratio, for example, because that's privileging the lie that it matters. So we'll learn about framing that briefly. So when you're establishing a progressive purpose, what does this branch of literature in psychology and language and linguistics tells us is that you would never start with the fact. In engaging with people, you would never start with the facts. You would never.
A bit wrong, really.
What's that?
That sounds a bit wrong.
It's exactly
bold
right.
Statement.
You would never start a debate by trying to dispute facts.
Okay.
Or what they think of as fact.
Yeah. So we often see in social media and just around the dinner table or in cafes or just with our children, we try to have a dispute about facts.
Yeah.
That's not going to lead you anywhere because the facts are framed in ways that don't allow us to reframe them. So what you've got to do is you've got to start with a big picture about aspirations. What do you want the economy to do? What are we expecting from our society? So you get people, you get a shared understanding in a discussion on what you want to be outcomes, like environmental sustainability and full employment and
Green New Deal.
Green New Deal and equity. They're big picture things. and those social purposes should be articulated and narrated in ways that activate frames in our brains that constrain the way we interpret information. So what linguists understand is that we respond to things in particular ways depending upon how they're presented to us, and that we can frame the same thing, we can frame it in one way and have a construal, it's called, what we think is an understanding of the reality. But we can have a totally different understanding of the same thing if we frame it in a different way. And so it's really important to understand when you're engaging as activists and trying to change the debate, to learn how to frame things. And I'll give you some examples. And then once you've established this broad picture and you've got the framing right, then you start talking about facts. Because setting up the frame allows you to then talk about the facts in a way that you want people to comprehend. So when I just say the unemployment rate's 10%, isn't that shocking? That's a fact, the 10% bit. Well, if a person who's been framed in a neoliberal way will say, yeah, 10% of the people are lazy, can't be bothered working, sitting on their asses because of income support, X, Y, Z. That's because they've been framed to interpret that fact in a very specific way, in a way that you don't interpret it. But you'll never get them to, there will never be a productive sort of dialogue going on if you don't share the same frame. That's the point. That's why you don't start with facts, yeah?
You haven't touched on the job guarantee so far.
I'm not going to today.
No, that ties in with what you were just saying about people just sit around doing nothing if you give them income support or universal basic income.
I mean, I'm just giving you some ideas today. I mean, I've done the job guarantee to death in the last 5 days. I'm bored with it. But it doesn't fit into this talk today anyway. No. So here's an example of broad purpose. There was a group of mayors in New Zealand who got so annoyed of the austerity of the New Zealand national government that the havoc it was causing in their local cities, that they created what was called the Mayor's Task Force for Jobs Task Force. And they established their purpose as zero waste of New Zealanders. That's a fantastic big picture that nobody could disagree with. Our youth, our future was another one they used. Now the point then is that anybody can say that, and politicians from either side say stuff like that. And they, you have the Australian government saying how wonderful they are when they're killing prosperity, but they say it's wonderful. And so the second point is that they can't just be those sort of motherhood statements. They've actually got to be associated with what we think of as concrete actions. And here in using the sort of framing literature, we have to invoke what are called event causation structures. Now, I'll give you an example. It sounds pretty mysterious, but so, for example, politicians from all sides of the spectrum will say, we support jobs for all. Tories and Labor support jobs for all. Who wouldn't? And everybody agrees with that. And of course, then what the Tories think of that is that if they free up the markets and deregulate, then there'll be jobs for all. That's their version of it. But that's not a progressive vision, even though we agree for jobs for all. So what we've got to do is frame specific event causation structures. So in other words, we have to add an appropriate action to operationalise jobs for all. So we might want to say, we want jobs for all, but that means that aggregate government spending has to rise by X% to generate Y million jobs. So we're relating the aspiration, the event, with an action. that's based upon an understanding of causation. So you just don't say, oh, yeah, let's have the Green New Deal. We say the Green New Deal requires a dramatic public-led transformation of the economy. So we've got the event jobs for all. We have a causation structure, government deficits. And we frame it in that way, and that conditions the debate. And progressive narratives tend to get lost in these value statements, jobs for all, and stuff like that. And so they think that they can disassociate causation. So the example of that is that on the one hand you've got John McDonnell saying we're going to have all this national infrastructure and we're going to have jobs for all and we're going to have national health services. And then
UBI.
Then what's that?
Yeah, he's saying he's going to have UBI now.
Yeah, but then in another sentence, he'll say we're going to have a Labor fiscal credibility rule.
And we'll get the money from the Cayman Islands.
And not understand that those two
That's
things
work against each other.
Exactly. And so he's lost in the values. We're going to have everything, but we don't have a causation structure that can deliver that. And that's why social democratic parties have been failing dramatically. They've been buying the neoliberal economic myth, hanging on to these value agendas, not realising that in a causation sense what they mean for the economic policies that they have.
And perhaps there's a certain amount of political cynicism involved in pandering to an establishment run by a wealthy...
Labor parties, or whatever they're called in different countries around the world, have got an inferiority complex. They've been told they're bad managers of money. That's what they get. That's the sort of story in Australia. All last week.
Socialists are great at spending other people's money.
They spend wild, and then they tax big, and they run, And so they've been led. They've been led into this inferiority response that they've got to be better managers than the rest. I mean, in Australia, the federal election campaign, we've got the Labor Party saying they'll run bigger fiscal surpluses than the Conservatives.
But that plays on the fact that people think they're the ones that are paying.
Your money that pays for government services.
So it's a cycle of...
That's why I said that there's education that's required, and then there's framing that's required to exploit the value of the education. So it's not enough for progressives to go out there with good framing if you also don't progressively educate the people you're trying to influence. It's quite complicated. And so another sort of metaphorical structure is this, what's called purposes or destinations. So when we define a purpose, we've also got to relate it to a destination. Now what that means is that we want to achieve these purposes and we succeed when we reach a specific destination. That's what the metaphor is about. This is the way we learn things. These metaphors are constructs that we use without knowing it in terms of understanding things. So we've got to define a destination in a progressive frame that's not related to a financial ratio, for example, like a fiscal credibility rule. We've got to define the destination in terms of people, for example. And so it's pointless to get locked into debates about financial ratios. That's just privileging the lie. So, you have a dispute, why is 80% threshold the threshold? That's just privileging the lie that there's any threshold of public debt ratio. So what about language? Well, this is a really tricky one, and Louisa and I are trying to write a technical manual at the moment on a progressive language, but it's tricky. We're having fun doing it. And so here's an example. The statement, government spent X million dollars. Well, think about what spent means. When I go for a run and I go fast, I'm spent. I've exhausted myself. That's sort of a negative thing. And the word spent, it's gone. Whereas we could reframe that saying government invested X million dollars to enhance our purposes. Because investment, we know that's for the future. Whereas spent is gone. It's really subtle.
You could say expended.
Yeah, but expending is using something up.
Yeah.
Whereas investment is building something up.
And it generates a return.
Yeah. And so, we're invoking what's called the more is up metaphor. We metaphorically associate our reality by thinking something that goes up is more and something that goes down is less. And we translate that into all sorts of understandings of things using that metaphor. And so investment is building something up rather than using it up, spending. That's an example of the subtlety of language. Government budget deficit. You'll note I never use the word budget to describe a government. This is why. Government budget deficit is X% of GDP. Well, the more is up metaphor that we intrinsically use works in reverse as well. Because a deficit, the word deficit, is a shortfall. And so reversing the more is up, we consider shortfalls to be bad. We haven't quite got there yet. That's not good. We've got less than we need. That's not good. And so and this is, I haven't really resolved this in my own mind yet in terms of language, but deficit is a difficult thing for progressives because it invokes this reversal of the more is up metaphor. And my compromise at the moment, until I work it out myself fully, and I may never, is that I don't use the word budget, because as soon as you use the word budget, you're invoking the household analogy.
Yeah.
That's why I use fiscal deficit. And then I immediately say fiscal policy is government spending and taxation. But as soon as you start talking about budgets, you're drawing the framing back into our individual experiences as households.
Investment in the future rather than deficits that are going to be a liability for the future.
Yeah, I mean, a more creative person than me will be able to come up with some really good things. That's true. Okay. And you can and linguists and framists and psychologists tell us that we can link metaphor. In our daily lives, we link metaphors, and so we can link the more is up metaphor using an appropriate event structure metaphor, which links the more is up metaphor with purposes of destinations metaphor. Now that sounds all too tricky, but it's simple, because what we would say that the destination must be prominent in your framing, in your statements. And so we say the government deficit rose and generated high levels of wealth for households and firms. You can see now we're saying that the rising deficit is a more is up metaphor, but because it's got the word deficit in there, it reverses in our thinking. But then if we supplement that with an event structure that invokes the purposes of the destination metaphor, we're relating that deficit to a higher level of wealth. More is up. And a destination, more is up. Wealth for households and firms, for people. So that's a very sophisticated manipulation of our cognition. Yeah.
I'm just thinking it would be better to start with higher levels of wealth for household and firms were caused by the government.
Yeah, but you don't get the causation structure then. The event causation metaphor's got to be in there. Because how do you get that? Because what the government says, Tory government say, if we run surpluses, people are better off. So this way, we know in modern monetary theory that deficits, we've just done the experiment, deficits increase non-government sector wealth. That's the event causation. But the deficit triggers a reverse more is up metaphor. So we've got to relate that to a purpose and a destination that we all can relate as good. And that statement is perfect for that, for example. And there's another concept called forced movement that we have. This is all fancy terminology for the way we actually work, even if we don't use that terminology. And forced movement is that the way we understand these metaphorical statements is that nothing's going to happen unless something happens. We're not going to trigger some destination unless something happens. So the deficits force a movement towards increased wealth. I'm just giving you a sample of this so that if you're interested you can... So we want the... We wanted to... There's this... In neoliberalism, there's sort of this world of natural events. That unemployment is a natural outcome. And we want to disabuse that notion and get people to understand forced movement and the responsibility or the causal force in that movement is the government using its currency. Because without that use, you won't get the destination that we consider to be good. Yeah? Yeah.
I mean, one problem we've got in the UK is there's something called the budget, which is announced.
It's not called the budget, it's called the fiscal statement. But go on.
No, in this country.
I know it's called that, but we're reframing.
The better phrase would be the fiscal statement.
No, it's called the budget. It's called the budget everywhere. But as progressives, we should talk about that thing, not invoking negative frames.
Sure. If we were to get in power, what would we rename that?
I think I'd name it a fiscal balance or a fiscal state.
Fiscal state.
Well, whatever. It's just it's a relationship between spending and taxing. You could work out any name, but you want to. I'm not suggesting that would be.
The problem is that name's so fixed in our deep political consciousness.
That is the problem.
Yeah, I know. Everything's fixed in it by framing, but construal tells us we can refix things.
Well, you need to come up with a good phrase.
Yeah, I know. That's what I'm just. This is about telling you that these things matter.
Yeah.
There's options we've got to use in arguments to promote our cause.
I'm pretty dumb, so people are much smarter than me will come up with really good phrases. But I'm just telling you that these things really matter, our language.
Yeah, sure.
So when we go on social media, you've got to think about the way you frame things.
The message is the medium.
Exactly, Marshall McLuhan. So a couple more minutes. And look, anyone who wants to get this can. I've got a whole list of the way in which neoliberalism uses metaphors. And so, for example, you can... I don't know if you... Oh, you've got the screens there. You know, they use things... Oh, so I've got... That's a good one. Oh, yeah. Jumps this bloody computer. That's
Twitter's not useful for point scoring?
What's that?
How dare you?
You're talking about your next slide.
Oh, something come up on the bullet point about Twitter is not useful for point scoring.
It's not.
It's not. No.
So here's these are metaphors that are used to advance neoliberalism. Government spends like a drunken sailor. The former Prime Minister of Australia, that was his classic phrase, Tony Abbott. The government is spending like when he was in opposition. Government is spending like a drunken sailor. Well, what does that invoke? Well, it's a metaphor. as children, we've learned about drunken sailors. They go into port, they go wild, they're wanton, delinquent, out of control. Well, using that metaphorical description invokes exactly the ideological response in us that they want. And so there's a whole lot of them. If you want to get these tables, I can give them to you. But the alternative way that Randy and I came up with was, for example, government spending. Government spending puts money in our pockets. That's a metaphorical statement. It doesn't actually, but it does in metaphorical terms. So in other words, the implied meaning is not delinquency and out of control, it's increasing our non-government income. And government invests in the productive capacity of our nation. Government spending increases our capacity to provide for the needs of the population, and so on and so forth. Whole lots of opportunities. So the last couple of slides, use of Twitter. It's really the research. There's a lot of now research in communications literature and stuff, and I've read all the current research on this to get my head around all this. It's not a good. It's not a debating forum. Yet it's become a debating forum, and so things get distilled down into pithy, meaningless statements that then get fed back to us as misrepresentations of what the complexity of our work is, or anything.
Trial by soundbite.
Yeah, and there's also a concept that they've identified, psychologists in analysing communication, called compassion fatigue, and that is that we get sick to death of hearing about tragedies. Believe it or not, we become inured to hearing about bad situations. They just end up not having any impact at all. And so torrents of facts about tragedies, about how devastating austerity is in UK on Twitter. You know, you're just tweeting all these facts out. It's a waste of time. It doesn't achieve the purpose. The facts are true. The motivations.
I think that it achieves their purpose.
Yeah.
It achieves their purpose because they want. If you repeat the lie, it reinforces the lie.
That's it.
And it desensitizes us to the fact that there is a food bank. There was never a food bank. We've heard it so many times. We've accepted it into our language, and we don't care about it anymore.
Yeah. And what Twitter has actually been found to be suitable for is leading a reader to a preferred destination, like a report or an article or something. Not reporting the report, not summarising the report, but just leading them there. And what the experts in the research says is that the way you frame the tweet can condition the way in which the person understands or perceives the report when they get there, the link when they get there. In other words, it conditions the starting point in the way they start, say, reading a report. So you can actually manipulate people to approach a report in a way that you want them to read that report rather than not. So you're reframing the way they... Did you have a question?
No, I was just going to say, it's a kind of meme generator, isn't it?
It is. And here's an example. 2 ways of framing something. A tweet. Local community faces 10% unemployment. Parents cannot feed their children. Tories to blame. It's just not going to have an effect. Whereas if you write, economy needs more jobs to bolster income and sales. Government stimulus created X million jobs during the GFC. See this article with a link. You've framed the metaphors properly. You've created the event causation structures. The persons are already conditioned to think government's created all these jobs, and then they read a research report that demonstrates that. And that research report may well articulate the fact that the austerity is hurting children's nutrition and all the rest of it. But by the time they've got to the report, they're in a positive frame, a progressive frame. Whereas that first one,
it's depressing.
It's compassion fatigue, and it's also interpreted by whatever the frame the person who's reading it has anyway. Okay, so I think that's it. Oh, there's this other thing called structural versus individual frame. This is a really interesting one, because if we frame everything in terms of a particular person, that's much less effective than if we talk about structures of systems. So, I always say that unemployment is a systematic failure to produce enough jobs. That's a structural construction of unemployment. Whereas a mainstream economist will say unemployment reflects significant individual preferences for leisure and work.
People choose it.
So they're framing it they're framing the same event in an individual way, whereas I frame it in a structural way. And that leads then to perceptions that it's a structural problem that has to be addressed, not the policy focus should be on structure rather than individual. There's all sorts of examples like that. That's a really strong finding in the research literature. And I think we're going to say end. And it couldn't have come sooner. Thank you.